we're delighted today to welcome Reverend Dr. Karen D. Scheib, who has returned to Candler as a scholar in residence after retiring in 2020 as professor of pastoral care and pastoral theology. She began teaching practical and pastoral theology at Candler in 1998 and served as the director of the school's Women, Theology, and Ministry program for many years. Her research interests include faith and health, theological and cultural dimensions of crises and trauma, and narrative theory and therapy. She's the author of all my favorite books that I've used in several classes. Challenging Invisibility, Practices of Care with Older Women. I've used that in my Families and Kin Networks class. Pastoral Care, Telling the Stories of Our Lives. That book I've used in our Intro to Pastoral Care class, and her most recent book, Attend to Stories, How to Flourish in Ministry. And this book is going to be the top, really the focus of our conversation today. She's distinguished for a lot of service and a lot of other writing that you could look up as well. I just have always appreciated the depth of theological reflection and attention to human life and the connection of heart and soul that characterizes Dr. Scheib's work. It's just really a delight to be with her today. She has really stood out in recent years as someone who's been thinking deeply about kind of how our ecclesiological traditions shape the imagination of our pastoral care. So I'm just thrilled to be here with you today, Dr. Scheib, and I'm looking forward to your presentation and our conversation together. So thank you for being here with us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor, and thank you for that lovely, humbling introduction. I appreciate that. Well, I wrote this book. I'll show you the cover, Attend to Stories, How to Flourish in Ministry. Because I was invited to give a lecture at the Georgia Pastor School, which is a continuing education event for North and South Georgia Conference. I'm a member of the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church. And I was a pastor before I went into teaching. So I was a pastor for about 12 years and had an experience of, near burnout, which I decided a good way to deal with that was to go to graduate school. So anyway, I ended up teaching most of my career, 22 years at Candler and 5 at St. Paul School of Theology. But I was invited to give a lecture on clergy self-care. This was in probably 2014 or 2016, because the book came out in 2018, fairly soon after. And I found myself struggling with that language of self-care. I think the idea is important, but being I don't know if any of you are in the Methodist system, but at least in the North Georgia Conference, candidates for ordination have to present a self-care plan. And if there are issues, health issues around weight or other health issues, those have to be addressed. And I found some of my students were more worried about their BMI than their theological answers for ordination. And I thought something's wrong with this model. So there's something wrong here. And so as I was doing the research for this, there had begun to be a shift from the self-care language to flourishing. But a lot of the early literature was what I call a medical model. And part of that was that some of the early studies on clergy health were done by Duke. And it had kind of a medical focus, partly because of the grant that shaped that. So there was discovery in, I think, the 1950s, pastors were pretty healthy, but I think starting in maybe the 80s, there was discovery that pastors had high rates of depression, high incidences of high cholesterol, obesity, anxiety, high blood pressure. And so there was an attempt to, in a sense, address those symptoms. And so that's what I mean, a kind of medical model. And so the self-care was around things like a lot of the books I read on self-care was eat well, reduce stress, exercise, and maybe some spiritual practices. Well, you can't live in the United States and have not heard the advice, eat well, exercise, reduce stress. And yet clergy were still struggling to care for themselves. And one of the studies from Duke indicated that clergy knew they should care for themselves, but felt they couldn't do it until they'd taken care of everyone else. And so, having written the previous book on narrative, the pastoral care telling the stories of our lives, and I use narrative in the book on aging as well. I was thinking about what are the stories we carry as clergy that keep us from flourishing. What are the stories that we carry about what it means to care for others or be in ministry that keep us from being able to attend to our own well-being? And in 2019, Matt Bloom came out with a book, Flourishing in Ministry. Some of you may know it, How to Cultivate Clergy Well-Being. My book came out in 2018, but Bloom had been doing this work for some time and has identified in that book 4 factors which contribute to clergy well-being. The other thing I think is there began to be the influence of positive psychology, which shifts from sort of diagnosing the problem, which was the early approach to clergy health. It was sort of more focused on ill health, and a shift to in positive psychology on what fosters our well-being and flourishing. And so that's, I think, an important shift. And Bloom identifies 4 factors of clergy well-being, and these are slides from another workshop, but I'll pull some and I'll send them to Dr. Helsel. So you'll have these, so you don't have to take extensive notes, and this is based on decades of research. He says the 4 elements of clergy well-being are daily well-being, which is the kind of the quality of our daily lives. And for him, that means there's more positive emotions and negative emotions. They're going to be both, but that there's more of one than the other. The second element is resilience, which is our ability to adapt, change, and grow. And I just want to say here, for those of you, I do a workshop on clergy flourishing, I'll say more about later. And a lot of the clergy we've worked with were appointed to new charges around the time the pandemic hit. And for those clergy, resilience was really stretched because there was so much rapid change required. Every time we thought we kind of turned the corner, something else happened. And so our resilience, I think, for clergy has been really pushed to its limit. So finding ways to address that. The third element he identifies as authenticity, which is our sense of self-identity and dignity. But this he links to what he calls an integrated self-narrative. And that's where it intersects with my work. And that's part of what I think I try to do in Attend to Stories, is help us look at our narrative and the stories that make that up and say, what are the stories that promote our flourishing and what are the stories that undermine that? And how might we address those stories and challenge them and revise them? And then the fourth element is thriving, which has to do with the values and beliefs that inspire us. And in the workshops I do, I work with a partner, Dr. McClure from Bright, who has expertise in working with the Hall-Tona value scales, which help us identify what our real values are. And they're not always what we think they are. But often, if we are in a place where we can't live out what we value and what gives us energy, then we'll find ourselves struggling. And so those 2 pieces are things we attend in the workshop. But my work particularly looks at the work of narrative. One of the things that Bloom says is that a pastor's identity, his or her sense of him or herself as a person and his or her sense of self as a pastor, is at the core of pastoral well-being. And our identities form as life stories, and our brain wires them into an autobiography of our lives, what research calls a life narrative. And so that's where, and what Bloom does is sort of identify this factor. What he doesn't do is sort of give us tools of how to interpret that narrative or dig into it. And one of the things that I've done, I call this story care. And it is built on the theological notion that God intends our flourishing. I have come to have life that you may have it abundantly. So it's that notion, which is, I think, very different than self-care, which is kind of, we have symptoms and we have to treat them. And what I've found is the term self-care often feels like, to clergy, one more thing you have to do for yourself, by yourself, which then you can end up not doing well. But if flourishing is God's intent, then that's something that we can claim as that as we intend to our flourishing, we're responding to God's desire for us to flourish and to help then others flourish. Because if we're not flourishing, we're not going to help anybody else do that either. So the idea is that this is a quote from Dan McAdams, whose work I use as well. He says, "If you want to know me, then you must know my story, for my story defines who I am. And if I want to know myself, to gain insight into the meaning of my life, then I too must come to know my own story." The problem is that we're, of course, living our story. So it's hard to get to see them often, except maybe in retrospect. And there are ways, and in what I develop in story care is a way to kind of dig into our stories, to understand what shapes us. And our stories are not simply our own creation. They're formed in the context of our families, of our culture, of our religious backgrounds. Bill Randall uses the term narrative environments, the environments of the stories. So you might think of a favorite children's story you grew up with. It might have shaped you in some way. For me, one of the stories was, I'm old enough to remember, The Little Engine That Could. Did anybody remember that story? So when I was about 5 or 6 to go to school, I had to ride up a big hill. And what did I do when I rode up the big hill? I said, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. So we carry these stories with us, and we carry the stories of our family. And sometimes the stories of our family are not always helpful. And I find that a narrative approach and family systems theory work very well together. And we might think of, if you think of Bowen-related systems theory, that we look at generational patterns, I think narrative can help us trace the stories that keep those patterns of relationship in place. So one of the things that I do with story care is what I've called life story exegesis. And I use the term exegesis very purposefully because I was intending to talk to clergy. It's something you do if you're preaching every Sunday. You're doing exegesis. You're interpreting a text. You're looking at its background, how the story was formed, who told the story, from what perspective. When you preach, you'll preach on the same text many times. So we take, say, the story of the prodigal son. You can preach it from the perspective of the father or the older son or the younger son, and you get different views of it. And I use the term exegesis. You could use the term close reading, which is from literature, because I wanted clergy to say, I have a tool that comes from my theological training that I can use to understand myself and others more deeply, so that we're not dependent only on psychological theories, and we can utilize those, but we have this sense that we are people of the story. We've been shaped by God's story. We are part of that, and that we can look at our own story. And so life story exegesis is a way of doing a close reading of our own life stories. And so that we can then identify those stories that are problematic and deconstruct them, revise them, reinterpret them, and also that we can construct a hopeful future story. This is a language that Andy Lester used, also a pastoral theologian, because what we think is possible in the future, in some ways, can be a projection of both our past and our present. And so if we see a kind of limitation in the present, we may not have the imagination that God intends for us to have, as Lester says, a future coming towards us, to create a hopeful future story. So this is the work of story care, and this is a kind of a very quick and large overview, but that's the work of story care. And in the book, and both in the workshop, one of the things I do is I demonstrate this exegetical model by looking at Barbara Brown Taylor and some other pastoral memoirs, but especially Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Leaving Church. And any of you know that book, it's her experience of not leaving the church, but leaving a church in the middle of a conflict. And I think it's her way of going back over and looking at what happened. And part of what she realizes is the story she carried about ministry and call kept her trapped in a feeling that she had to take care of everybody else, which then led to her own burnout. And if you know anything of her life, she reinterpreted her sense of ministry so that writing and speaking became her ministry. And the first book, actually after leaving church, was called An Altar in the World, which makes perfect sense because that's the move that she made. So again, I'll stop and see if you have questions. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into the deconstruction practice, but that's one of the things that I in the book I talk about the different pieces of story care, the different steps in story care.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful if you looked into that a little bit for us.
Let
Yeah,
me,
great. Thank you.
okay. So there are 4 steps of life story exegesis, and they're anytime you put steps, it makes them seem separate, but they're always kind of moving back and forth. So the first thing is to, and this is what you find in the attentive stories. I have a version of this in the pastoral care book, but I simplified it. I think this is a more helpful version, is that we attend to the backstory. That's sort of the personal history, the influence of the family story. And we also look at the culture and that we're part of that's also related to step 2. But if you read a novel, it always starts in the middle. And when people tell stories or we tell our own story, we sort of start where we are in the middle. There's a memoir called Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson, I think. The opening line is, "My mother used to tell me the devil sent her to the wrong crib." Wow, that's like, what? What's the backstory? Why would she say that? I mean, obviously it's something her mother told her. So a family story that she's been told that she carries, which can't be one that helps her flourishing, that the devil sent her to the wrong crib. So she was an adopted child. And the only book allowed in her house was the Bible. So she went to the public library. She grew up in England, and read through from A to Z, basically. And part of her memoir is the way reading stories opened her imagination to craft a different story for her own life. So attending to that backstory, the influence of family stories. The second step is analyzing the narrative environments, the culture, the community, the church that we're part of. Also part of the narrative environments is something that Bill Randall calls master narratives. Those larger narratives about gender, race, sexuality, ways of knowing that sort of shape us. I learned to read using the Jane and Dick reading books. Okay, I see somebody nodding that you're old enough to remember those. And they were supposed to be teaching us to read, but of course, everybody in them was white. Jane wore pink and stood by the sidelines and did nothing. Dick was the only one who was active, or maybe the dog, Spot. So they not only taught us to read, they also contain these master narratives about gender and race and other things that have become part of our stories. So part of this, and this also draws from narrative therapy that uses a kind of, that looks at the dominant discourses in the culture and how they influence our own stories and sort of what's possible for us or not possible. And master narratives also, in a sense, set rules about who gets to speak and whose speech is believed. And that's another thing that impacts our narrative. So we look at those things in our stories. Another step is to name stories that are problematic stories, or the stories that leave us languishing. And I talk about specific types, there are many times, but stories that confine us, that say, and this can be related to master narratives. I worked with a lot of students who came out of traditions where women didn't preach, and they had to change tradition to follow their call. Or you can't do that because of your gender, or you can't do that because that's not what pastors do. You can't behave that way or wear those clothes, or I'm sure you all have stories about, because parishioners have their own stories of what a pastor is, and they don't always fit who we are. And then also stories that are undertold, they can be stories of our own competence, but they can also be stories of things we don't pay attention to, both in our lives or the congregation. And Barbara Brown Taylor, the church she was at was a church in North Georgia, and she had been a pastor in Atlanta, and she and her husband had driven to North Georgia to look at they found this basically little white church in the country. And she said, "Oh, I want this church." But there was a pastor in it. Well, he died suddenly, and she became the pastor of that church. And one thing she never really fully addresses in the memoir, and it may be of choice, or it may just be that it wasn't fully addressed. She never fully addresses the congregation's grief at losing that pastor. And I often wondered how the conflict that she ends up in was related to the grief that was unresolved. So that's, and often churches have these untold stories, and we also may have untold stories that can affect us. And then finally, as we sort of work through these dimensions, we hopefully move towards revising our stories, reinterpreting them, or restoring is the term, again, that I borrowed from Bill Randall, to promote our flourishing. So those are the sort of the steps of that we go through. And in the book, I work through those steps in looking at Barbara Brown Taylor's own life, to give an example of what that looks like. Another thing I talk about in the book is the importance of self-compassion when we're doing this work, is to be gentle with ourselves. It's easy to look back and say, oh, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or I should have known that. And so I have a section drawing on the work of Kristen Neff on self-compassion. And I also, being a Methodist, draw on Wesley's general rules, which were do no harm, do good, and attend to the ordinances of God. And when Wesley's talking about do good, he introduces that by saying, do mercy of every kind. Mercy and compassion are synonyms. So we're to be merciful to ourselves. And again, there's a text, Old Testament text, be merciful as your God is merciful. One of the stories I think some of us inherit is I would say, a misinterpretation of the Great Commandment. I learned about this when I moved to the South. I'm from the West Coast. The acronym JOY, have any of you heard of that? Jesus first, others second, yourself third. Well, I'm pretty sure if we look at the text, that it says, love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, love others as yourself. They're not hierarchical. The assumption is we can't do one without the other. But often a kind of theological story we pick up is that they're hierarchical. That first I love God, and then I love others. And if I've managed to do as well, then I can love myself. That's why I think the other problem, I think, with the term self-care is that to a lot of clergy, it feels selfish. And if we're trying to love others, then it feels like a conflict. So being compassionate is being merciful to ourselves as we say, look, I inherited these stories. So when I'll tell you one of mine quickly, and then I'll take a break. When I was 14, my mother was diagnosed with a fast advancing non-remitting form of MS. Now she died in 1979. So this would have been 1969. I was 14, I think. And they didn't make those distinctions at the time. So by the time I graduated from high school, she was pretty much bedridden and was unable to feed herself, probably when I was around that time. So one of my jobs was to feed her. Didn't have home health care, wasn't available at that time. She was too young. We didn't qualify for Medicaid or Medicare. So my job was to make sure she ate. I had to feed her, literally feed her. So what did I learn from that story? That taking care of another is a life and death matter. That's not a helpful lesson to carry into ministry. It made it not easy for me to say no. If taking care of someone, and that was it's not a story that was told to me. So when we talk about the stories we carry, they're not just things that are told to us. They're the way we experience or interpret our own life events. And so I carried this story that caring for others was a life and death matter. And then when I was ordained, and this is when I was ordained an elder, it's a two-step process at that time in the Methodist Church. I was working with a senior pastor who'd been the conference secretary. And for those of you who aren't Methodist, he works with a bishop and they serve a term. And he was finishing his term and the bishop was congratulating on his job well done. And he said, he works 12, 14, 16 hours a day. He kept increasing the hours. And for me, that was a story of this is what's expected of you in ministry. So I loaded that story on top of taking care of people as a life and death matter. And until I could become aware of those stories. And some of this work for me, frankly, was through therapy. But I do think we can begin on our own to begin to identify what stories am I carrying that are inhibiting me from flourishing and from caring for myself. And so that's the work that I do in this book and that I do in some of the workshops.
I found myself really like underlining a lot of the book, but I underlined a lot in the restoring chapter, and I found myself kind of underlining a phrase, not knowing God's love in our broken places. And then also a phrase, I think it's from your own journey here, I can lose what's dear to me and not be lost. Um, I just found these discoveries that you shared with us out of kind of the depths of your own personal experience and your journey to be so intimate and tender and wise and such a gift to us as we think about caring for our stories. You talk about not always feeling the freedom to love from the depths of your soul. And it was just really like profound to be led through that journey. I was also really drawn up by the exercise at the end about the person that you had a hard time loving. I I didn't like that one. I just learned from immediately. Like, it didn't even take me any time, but I learned a lot from it. Um, I don't know. I don't know if I have a question as much as just a couple of comments, and you could go wherever you want with them. I was wondering kind of like, how do people slow down and see if their stories no longer fit? Um, how do you help students who are burned out from family caregiving, but yet they're pursuing seminary or something like that? I mean, I
Mhm.
think sometimes people come to seminary as a kind of major story change. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, and then I also thought about kind of the concept from Buddhist meditation about like a story maybe being defensive. And I don't know if you've, oh, that's just a story, like kind of like our thoughts, like
Mhm.
um, sometimes the stories we tell have an element of like cheerleading ourselves or like defending the best version of ourselves over and over again. I don't know. I just, that's a like, those are just a couple of thoughts that I had. And I don't know, you could take those wherever.
Well, I mean, for one thing, stories are built on memory, and what we now know about memory is that memory is highly unreliable. Most of us, I think, even me, still tend to think of memory as if it is this like computer memory. There's actual information there, and what we know about our brains is that basically memories are recreated every time we think of them. It's pulling on something, but how they're stored in our neurons. What we know about neuroscience now. It's amazing there's any consistency to our memory at all. Um, so, and often we do forget things. So, or we remember them in a particular way. And I don't remember if I told this story in the book about that I was hospitalized when I was a child 3 times. And, as a child, and that was in a day when children were just put in the hospital and parents were only allowed to visit during visiting hours. And I was 7 years old. It was really scary. And I ended up, it was a blood related illness called ITP, and somebody came in every day to take blood. And, my experience was kind of feeling abandoned really by my family. Like, why did they leave me here? And it wasn't until I was an adult that I could say, well, they were taking care of me because they wanted me to be well. But as a child, I had that kind of emotional experience and I had to relearn, that part of the story. And as I said, a lot of this work, I think any good therapy really is a kind of restoring, is helping us understand these stories that we carry. And I do think part of the story work is learning to hold them loosely, that they do reflect, stories do shape who we are and reflect who we are, but we can hold them loosely. And one thing would for me to say, well, if my parents were telling the story, what does that story of my illness look like from their perspective? How does that give me a different understanding and see the broader picture? How might I tell that story from God's perspective? How God was in that. And one of the experiences was they thought I might have leukemia. So I had a bone marrow test, and we had a family physician whose daughter was my age and we were in school together. And he came to take me to the test. My parents weren't there. And a nurse brought in a wheelchair and he pushed the wheelchair aside and he picked me up and carried me in his arms to the test. Now, if that's not grace, I don't know what is. That experience of being cared for in that way to me is more than just his care. It's being sort of held in love. And to me, that's the center of my theology, as you know, is love is central to that. So I I think that it's hard to do this work on our own. I think to do this in a small group, that's why we offer these workshop opportunities, to do it in therapy, to do it in a safe clergy group. I say safe because sometimes denomination put us in clergy groups and they aren't always helpful, but to find a group of people with whom we can work together. If I'm struggling in ministry, and stories are not only our own, stories come from the inside out, but also there are stories put on us by others. And this is a challenge in the church because every parishioner has a different story of what a minister should be. The denomination has a story of what a minister should be. So we have these outside in stories put on us. And one of the things I talk about in revising is what I call narratives of resistance. How do we push against those stories that are imposed on us, that are not helpful to us, that are asking us to be not our authentic selves, which is, again, part of what Bloom says is central to our well-being as ministers. One thing that struck me about a lot of pastoral care books is they tell you how to do it right, or they give examples how somebody did it right, but they rarely give examples of when someone did it wrong and what they learned from it. And so I was very intentional in both books of showing how I messed up and what I learned from that. In terms of pastoral care, because none of us get it right the first time. So I think, as you said, being willing to look honestly at ourselves, which is a confessional act, right? To look honestly at ourselves helps us then to be honest with each other. And I think people in churches are longing for that kind of authenticity, both from us as pastors and to be able to do that. And if we can model that, I think it helps people do that with one another. So the last chapter of the book, I talk about different practices for flourishing. And one of those for me is writing, one of the practices of self-care. But I have a whole chapter on writing as a spiritual practice. And there is a kind of writing called expressive writing. Expressive writing is a kind of journaling where you take a particular issue you're struggling with, or it may be a relationship. This may be what he's referring to, of a person you have a hard time with, and you write a journal about it for 15 minutes a day for a set period of time. I think it's 3 or 4 days. There are books on, Pennebaker and Smith have written a book called Expressive Writing, Words That Heal, that tell you how to go through this process. And they've done a lot of research on this, using it in lots of different groups. And so you pick something particular you're struggling with, you write on it for 15 minutes a day, not just your thoughts, not just complaining, but your emotional state. Really think about it thoroughly, and then to kind of process it and work it through. And when they've tested groups before and after, their blood pressure is lower, they have lower stress hormones, they have all kinds of their physical outcomes, they have fewer doctor visits in the time after this process of writing. And so I think for clergy who often can't discuss everything they're doing, this kind of expressive writing can be really healing. So there's a lot of research that shows that it is a healing practice. Another practice I don't know in there is in do no harm. The idea is that one of the things Wesley says is do not engage in uncharitable or unprofitable conversations. So we often do that to ourselves. We have unprofitable, uncharitable conversations with ourselves. Our inner critic gets a little too big. And another exercise that I can't remember if I mentioned in the book is telling your inner critic, thank you for your opinion. I have another one. You're free to go. It's sort of letting them go. And that's also being compassionate, to realize we carry those inner critics, but that we get to a point where we can sort of speak back to them and have another perspective. Well, let me say a little more about the workshops I do. So some of you may be interested. So I've been working for the past about 6 years with Dr. Barbara McClure at Bright Divinity School, and they have a grant through the Lilly Foundation, which is Thriving in Ministry. And one piece of those is called the Flourishing in Ministry workshops. We do them twice a year. We started in 2018, and then, of course, in 2020, they were in person the first year through 2018 and 19. And then in 2020, we went online. And they were originally a week. It's now, I think, 3. We start on a Sunday and we finish on a Wednesday. And we go through this process of story exegesis. So one of you have the opportunity to look at, I go through some of this information in more depth, the practices of story care, and we do, it's participatory. We work on our own stories. There's several exercises. I use the Tree of Life. We give you an opportunity to identify a story that's problematic and to work through that, to revise it, to create a hopeful future story. That's the piece of the workshop that I do. And that work is related again to Bloom's notion of this authentic self in an integrated life narrative. The second piece Dr. McClure does on Tuesday is using the Hall Tona values inventory. And Hall and Tona were 2 religious educators that developed this value instrument to help identify the values that really shape our lives that we're often unaware of. And our values and our stories are connected because our values often are reinforced by stories. So the 2 of those pieces go together. So the second part of the work we do is discovering the values that guide us. And it's the values that Hall and Tona define have very particular definitions. So they're a little different than sort of like we might say honesty, but they may be things like word is a value, which has to do with communicating to others in a way that transforms their life. Or another value I'm thinking might be solitude and compassion, solitude, and I can't remember the other term of it is companionship, but it's the idea of both being alone and with others. But they look at the way those form us and also how they are expressed in our organizational life. And by discovering those values, often we find that people aren't aware of, they're aware on one level what the value is, but not sort of how deep it is ingrained in them. And they often discover that they're not living out their values, which is part of why they feel like they're not languishing. And because of that piece of values is connected to what Bloom describes as thriving, that being able to know what our values are and live them out authentically. So these workshops are offered twice a year. We just did our October workshop, October 8th through 12th, and we'll have another one in April. I don't know if the dates are set yet, but you can, if you're interested, just email me. Dr. Helsel can put that up for you. It may be on, I tried to find it on their website at Bright. It's not up yet. It's a Sunday through a Wednesday. There's a small fee. The most that you would pay is $175. And that's assuming your congregation has a budget of more than $40,000. So it's very affordable. And the grant also will pay you to stay in a retreat center so you can focus on this work. We do a lot of writing prompts. We do small group work. It's deep, intense work, but we've seen people's lives. I've seen people, just this last group, people come in exhausted and drained, and they find new energy. They find an open future story. They find possibility. And it's largely the work they do with each other and with themselves. We just set the frame and provide the guidance. And those will be continuing for at least the next 3 years. The grant continues, I think.
Dr. Scheib, I just love all your work, and your first book, Challenging Invisibility, Practices of Care with Older Women, is just really a radical and revolutionary book. And whenever I bring it around with me and read it, I have older women talking to me about their experiences of being invisible. Like they just tell me about it because I have the book out. I didn't know if there was and I love what you did in that first book with, I trust it is your first book, with understanding the narratives that come to us from culture and deconstructing those, but also having in mind another narrative for old age and for the life cycle. That is such rich, theological work that you're up to in that book. And I don't think there's anything quite as good about aging and pastoral care in our field right now as that book. So I think that's such an important issue as well. I don't know if there's any themes that you see that tie through your earlier works that you might want to pick up or say, I think about that differently now, or like just make some connections
Yeah.
for us? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was my first book. It was not my dissertation. My dissertation was, I used Daniel Stern's work because my training was more psychodynamic and psychoanalytic. And I was really looking at sort of what's pastoral about pastoral counseling. And I looked at the interpersonal sphere and how that shaped and how that's related to kind of an I-thou relationship and whatnot. That was my dissertation, which I didn't publish. So after I finished the dissertation, I actually ended up doing a certificate in gerontology. And it was that sort of led me to this. And when I wrote that book when I was in my 40s, now I'm 69. Yeah, it's probably 49 because it came out a while ago. It's not new. And now I am an older woman. I wasn't then. But part of the reason I wrote that is that my mother died at 46. So I didn't have her as an example, but my grandmother lived with us to help take care of my mother. And I think I say in the introduction, my first college roommate was my grandmother because we shared a room together in our house when I grew up. And I found when I was teaching at St. Paul, a lot of my students were in parishes with mostly older adults, largely older women, and they had very stereotypical notions of them. And I wanted to get a sense of what the experience of aging was like for older women, which is a fine research question, but a terrible interview question. So I just started with, tell me something about your life. And one of the questions is, what does it mean to be old? And almost every woman started, and I completely relate to this now. I'm not old, but the image of age was the cultural image of that you are disconnected, you're not interested, you're not interesting, you're not active. And that was not at all what I found in the women. And the title came from the interview. It wasn't originally my title for the book, but from the interviews that when women told me they felt invisible. And of course, one story is of this older couple, lesbian couple. One liked to shop and her partner didn't. So she would stand in this shopping mall and juggle. She wasn't invisible then. One of the stories was a woman I knew was a friend of mine, pastor's wife, who talked about being in a church event, setting up for an event with two younger women standing next to her, talking about how they talked to some older women in the church, and it was very interesting. They actually enjoyed it while completely ignoring my friend who was standing next to them. So I guess I have a different perspective now because I am in that category. At the time, I was interviewing women over 65, and now I'm there. So I both see that. So in terms of changing my mind, I'd have to think about that. I guess I feel, if anything, it's more of how we live out those narratives of resistance to be different than, the expectations or the assumptions that are put on us. And it's not related just to aging. It relates to all kinds of categories, right? Where we constrain people into particular ways of being. But even then, I was working with the narrative, not in the same depth, but the idea that our stories shape us. Because I did interviews, and the interesting thing was, and I think as I did more narrative work, is I would just start with, tell me something about your life story, and it was really interesting to see where people started. Some people started from birth. Some people started from what was happening right now in a challenging event. One woman, I remember this, started with her conversion at age 7 when she went up and, took Jesus. And her husband had just died. And there was a Bible sitting on the table. And part of what she was saying in that story is, my faith is important to me. And that's what's helping me cope with the death of my husband. So that's where I began, I think, even in those interviews, to begin to say that stories aren't about information. They're about who we are and how we see ourselves and how we see God moving in our lives. And that when we listen for stories, it's not just, it's a little different than active listening. We do that, but it's also inviting someone to imagine dimensions of the story they haven't thought about, or for us to hear. And one of this is actually, I learned in a writing workshop, tell me your story and I'll find mine. When we listen to another person's story, and this happens in the workshops when we have people dig into their stories and share with each other, people who on the surface seem to be quite different sometimes have stories that are quite similar. And that those things we struggle with, we're usually not the only person struggling with that. Someone else may have a similar story. So I think stories are really just powerful. And of course, as a people of faith, we are people of story. We're people of the book. We're shaped by a story. God is, and I'm using story in, a loose sense, but in that sort of narrative of how we understand ourselves as people of faith. So. Called the Haltona Values Inventory. And so there are some publications about it. There is, if you Google it, you'll also find there's an organization that gives the test. Usually it's not easy to self-interpret the test. Usually there's someone who's trained. So Dr. McClure is trained in giving this values test. And we do that as part of the workshop. You take the test, and then part of what she does is help you interpret it. Because it's not quite like the Myers-Briggs. You can sort of just understand it on your own. But you may, I know that there are people that do this work. Dr. McClure does some of this as a consultant on a consultant basis. We do it in the workshops. I think it's called Values Tech is the company that administers the test. And they may also have people that can help you interpret that. There's a small fee to take the test, and but you do sort of need someone to help you understand it, because it's again, the way they use values. The interesting thing is Haltona developed this when working with Paulo Freire. So it was based on what Freire learned, that people learned to read when they were reading about things that mattered to them. So that is what sparked their interest in how do people's values motivate them and shape the way they live their lives. So it has an interesting background to it.
I don't know if we have time for one more quick question. Dr. Scheib, I wonder if you would do you have any words for people out there whose stories are just kind of tender right now or difficult to bear? Maybe this is a challenging story season, or they've walked through a very challenging story season in their life that kind of has taken them by surprise. Do you have any words of advice or guidance for them?
Well, let me think about guidance. Advice, once I heard advice is worth what you pay for it. So if it's free, what does that say? So, I would go back to saying to be compassionate. Think of, again, see yourself through loving eyes. If someone else you knew were going through the same tender story, what would you say to them? How would you be compassionate to them? How would you listen to them? I did this one exercise you can do is you're sort of saying that you're in the current situation is to write a letter to yourself. I actually did this in a prison setting. I had women's prison inmates write a letter to their younger self to forgive themselves for the mistakes they made, because they were made, perhaps maybe they were doing the best they could at the time, or the things they didn't know. So I think to be merciful to yourself, to be compassionate to yourself, to be accepting that we're only human, and to be sometimes as preachers we're really good about proclaiming God's love to others, and we're maybe not as good as allowing ourselves to feel the depth of that love embracing us. So that to me is to be self-compassionate, is to open ourselves to God's compassion that surrounds us and God's mercy. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scheib. I'm really glad I got a chance to ask that question. That was such a good answer. Well, I have learned so much today about kind of the narrative environment that we all live in. And I've learned like how saturated we are by stories, and how like even the self-care story itself doesn't work very well. When you think about the complexity of ministry and like the medical model that it comes from. And for me, you're revising of stories that you lay out here with the help of others, with some trusted people who can help you deconstruct what's come to you without being aware of it. And your really guidance all the way through towards a through point of compassion that really comes from taking the time to witness to your own self, I think really adds something significant to me in my understanding of what it means to love yourself as your neighbor. And so I just am really grateful for your presentation today, Dr. Scheib, and for what it's given us. I think it's been a very distinctive contribution to our series. So I'm really glad you took the time to be with us.
Yeah, and if people come up with questions later, because sometimes it takes a while, if anyone sends questions to you, feel free to forward them to me and I can answer back. I noticed someone said that something about, this was a dissertation about the difference between pastoral care and psychological care. And I think that's one of the things that, and I think you've written about that too, Phil, haven't you? About
just a little bit,
psychological care is that, the pastoral care draws on psychology, but it should be theologically grounded. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And that's, I started as a pastor and I sort of became a scholar accidentally, is what I sort of feel. And so that's what guides me is that, that call to be pastoral, to be compassionate is, and we can use the psychological tools, but again, for me, it's rooted in the notion of God's love. That's central to my theology. I think that's what we're called to do, to be with one another and with ourselves. And I think that we've struggled with, there's a lot of history, and I talk about this in the book, about self-love, that we think somehow that's a bad term. But if God loves us, how can we not love ourselves? And we have to just think about what that means. And we do that not for our own self-aggrandizement, but in order to be the people God has called us to be, so we can be with and authentically in ministry to others. So,
yeah, thank you.
It's been fun. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a good conversation. Nice to see you. And so to all those of you out there listening, bless you. May you flourish in ministry. May you be kind and compassionate to yourselves. And may you find the stories that give you life. So that's my benediction for you. So.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah.